The stacks smell of cedar tonight. Not because anyone has been polite enough to panel the undercroft in fresh wood. No. These stones were old when cedar was still only a rumor in the hearts of saplings, and they have long since made peace with damp dust, wax, and the papery sigh of untroubled neglect. Yet somewhere a box has been opened, or perhaps a pressed sprig slipped loose from an atlas, and now the hidden library wears for an hour the memory of a forest that once believed itself permanent. That is how certain cities return, not first as maps, not first as ruins, as scent, resin, a drift of leaf shadow, the idea of boughs above stone. One catches the smallest remnant, and at once the whole dead argument comes walking back through the mind, stately and impossible, trailing song behind it. On the desk before me lies a branch, or what was once a branch. It has been petrified, smooth as worked marble, veined with pale green fire when the candles strike it at an angle. Someone long ago carved along its length a single line in espruar so worn the letters must be read with the fingertips more than the eyes. I know the phrase already. I knew it before I touched the wood. I suspect half the wiser dead know it too. Within these bounds and under the mythal, anything is possible once we learn to live together in peace. A very dangerous sentence, not because it is false, because it is expensive. Above us, Waterdeep goes on in its ordinary genius for noise. Wheels grumble over wet street stone. Somewhere a barge chain knocks in the harbour with all the solemnity of a bad drummer. Two apprentices are probably quarrelling over whose fault some pot of glue became smoke. A dog has adopted a doorstep and an opinion. All of this comforts me. Great cities at their healthiest are not abstractions. They are accumulations of daily toleration. Doors closing, bread cooling, watch shifts changing. A lamp being trimmed by someone who assumes the city will still be there tomorrow. Myth Drannor was not merely a place of arches, mythal light, and ballads embarrassed by their own beauty. It was, for a long while, a functioning answer. You have found your way again to the Lich's tale, a Faerûn Lorecast. I am Aurelian Cantonine, Baelnorn Lorewooden, custodian of unflattering continuities, and a patient enemy of histories that mistake cynicism for wisdom. I keep these records because the dead have been simplified enough already. One age turns them into saints, another into warnings, a third into decorative ruins, convenient for looting. My office, by oath and temperament, is to spoil such neatness. Civilizations are arguments made visible. If we are to inherit them at all, we must inherit the complication. Last time we stood beneath a falling sky. We watched Netheril answer systemic crisis with a spell vast enough to trespass into divinity. We followed the Faerûn's long ecological murder, the brittleness of magical infrastructure, Karsus's magnificent overreach, the death of Mistral, the rise of Mistra, and the remaking of magic under stricter law. We asked why later Faerûn fears certain heights of spellcraft, why Netherese ruins still glitter like bait in the minds of archmages and adventurers, and why brilliance ungoverned by proportion becomes a public hazard. Tonight we walk into a city built on the opposite impulse. Not a city that tried to escape the world by rising above it. A city that tried to welcome the world in. Myth Drannor. Cormanthor remade into the City of Song, the city of brotherhood, the city of love, the city of bards. A place where elves, humans, dwarves, gnomes, halflings, and other goodly folk did not merely trade at arm's length beneath suspicious laws, but lived together, studied together, forged together, patrolled together, prayed within sight of one another's sanctuaries, and for centuries attempted what most of Toril is too frightened, too proud, or too bloodied to attempt for even a generation. Yes, I mean it exactly as the title promises. Myth Drannor may well have been the best idea anyone ever had in Faerûn. That does not mean it was simple. Indeed, one of the reasons I revere it is that it was not simple at all. The most childish reading of Myth Drannor says that it was a naive utopia, a moonstruck fantasy of singing elves and grateful guests, until reality, in the form of monsters and treachery, arrived to restore seriousness. That reading is lazy. The opposite childish reading says it was a lie from the beginning, an elven vanity project dressed in soft language and sustained by unequal power until the mask slipped. That too is lazy. Reality, as usual, is more demanding. Myth Drannor was an ideal made operational. That is why it matters. Coronel Eltergrim's opening was not merely a poem with legal consequences. It was a political wager. The city's mythal was not only a wonder, but a constitution written in magic, privilege, fear, hospitality, and constraint. The gates of the city were not just conveniences of travel, but statements about what a civilization believed it could survive. The mixed guilds, mixed soldiery, and shared streets were not decorations around the true elven state. They were the state, or rather, the best thing the state wished itself to become. And when Myth Drannor fell, it did not fall because coexistence had never worked. It fell after centuries in which coexistence worked so well that later ages became sentimental about it. No, its fall came because the labor of preserving such a city proved heavier than beauty, nobler than nostalgia, and less forgiving than its founders hoped. A great idea, if it is to endure, must survive not only enemies but succession, administration, resentment, class, scale, routine, institutional fatigue, unequal risk, and the quiet return of prejudice through any crack left unattended. We must therefore speak tonight of many things at once. Of Cormanther before the opening, and why the elves of that realm did not suddenly awaken one morning yearning to host humans out of pure benevolence. Of Eltargrim Irithil, who understood before many of his peers that demographic reality is more persuasive than aristocratic dislike. Of the long peacemaking that led from guarded pact to shared city. Of the Standing Stone and the Dales, of Elminster's inconvenient arrival, of Starim Rage, of the raising of the Mythal in 261 DR, and of the city's renaming in honor of an older elf whose heart had crossed a boundary many of his descendants still distrusted. We must speak of daily life in living Myth Drannor. That is essential. I will not have this city remembered only by its end. We must understand what it felt like to walk its bridges, pay its tolls, breathe its weather-softened air, see its driftlights rise, watch barefoot halflings and dignified gold elves quarrel in the same market, and discover that in this one corner of Toril, trust had become so habitual that even fashion began exposing the heart on purpose. We must speak too of what I will call the Charter of Myth Drannor, though not in the crude mortal lawyer sense of a single sealed document. The city had no neat little parchment upon which every contradiction obligingly signed its name. Its charter was larger and messier than that. It consisted of the opening, the mythal, the military, the markets, the civic habits, the deliberate mingling of peoples, and the stubborn insistence that peace among races need not remain an occasional treaty topic discussed by diplomats who then go home to separate tables. And then we must speak of realpolitik, because all worthwhile ideals eventually meet quartermasters. Myth Drannor was armed, Myth Drannor was warded, Myth Drannor was selective. Myth Drannor's mythal gave special daily protections to elves even while welcoming non-elves into the city's embrace. Myth Drannor relied on armathors, court mages, toll gates, military patrols, racial interdicts, and difficult judgments about who may enter, who may settle, and which threats do not deserve tolerance merely because tolerance is in fashion this century. If that sounds untidy, good. A civilization trying to remain both open and alive should sound untidy. Then, when we have earned the grief, we come to the weeping war, not as a single lurid collapse, but as a long unmaking. More than 80 battles across 12 discernible campaigns, ancient imprisoned evils escaping into a complacent age, a fiend-led host of nearly 60,000 creatures forged out of orcs, gnolls, hobgoblins, ogres, trolls, bugbears, and yugoloths into something worse than a horde because it possessed strategy. We must speak of how Myth Drannor fought, who stayed, who fled, who was blamed, who was scapegoated, and why later elf histories so often slandered the very non-elves who bled most stubbornly for the city's survival. And above all, we must speak of gates. Literal gates of high magic. Public arches that linked the city of song to sister settlements and distant allies. Metaphorical gates by which knowledge, trade, migrants, schools, fashions, cults, ambitions and responsibilities crossed into and out of the city. For this is the deepest strategic lesson of Myth Drannor. Every open gate is a promise and a problem. Close them all and you betray the city's purpose. Open them without discipline and you multiply the surfaces by which danger may touch you. Keep them open in peacetime and prosperity grows. Keep them open in war and the map becomes a list of wounds. Close them in wartime and you may save a remnant while destroying the principle that made the city worthy of saving in the first place. Yes, my apprentice, it is one of those episodes. Before we step under the boughs of the greatest civic gamble in Faerûn's remembered past, a word from our sponsor, who I am pleased to say continue practicing the unfashionable and genuinely heroic art of building systems that can survive ordinary use by actual people. This episode is brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. If you need a website, clean technical architecture, or the sort of competent maintenance that prevents a good idea from collapsing into a haunted ruin 6 months after launch, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. They understand what many founders, princes, guildmasters, and archmages do not, that elegance without upkeep is merely future archaeology. Structure matters, clarity matters. Gates should be where you intended them to be. And unlike certain ambitious city builders of old, they do not assume that generosity and security will sort themselves out if everyone simply means well enough. Now then, pull your chair closer. Tonight, we are not in a desert. We are under leaves. Begin, as one ought, by refusing the sentimental version. Myth Drannor was not born because elves suddenly became wiser than other peoples. Elves are capable of generosity, yes. They are also capable of building prejudice into ceremony, custom, inheritance, and architecture, with a refinement that humans, for all their vulgar speed, sometimes lack the patience to equal. Cormanther before the opening was already a great realm, old in power and dense in memory. Its coronals ruled from Cormanthor, and the forest was no empty green generosity waiting for later races to bless it with relevance. It was a living elven domain, ordered by long usage, high magic, lineage, pride, and the quiet assumption that others, however tolerated, were visitors to a story authored elsewhere. Yet even proud realms must eventually acknowledge arithmetic. North and west of the forest, human settlements thickened. The dales were not a passing inconvenience. Dwarven powers endured in their own ancient jurisdictions. Trade routes, monster pressures, and the ordinary fecund insolence of humankind made one fact increasingly difficult to ignore. The forest might remain elven, but the world around it would not remain empty of others merely because elven nobles preferred their map cleaner. The pact at the Standing Stone matters here, and not only because later calendars take their count from it. At the dawn of Dala Reckoning, representatives of the elves and the burgeoning human dales reached formal peace. This was not yet Myth Drannor. Let no one confuse the first handshake with the later marriage. But the pact mattered because it made coexistence imaginable in political rather than purely anecdotal terms. Not an elf who once liked a particular human hunter, not a dwarf and an elf who happened for an interval to hate the same orcs. A framework, a recognition that neighboring peoples may prefer law to attrition if the alternatives are sufficiently annoying. Annoyance is one of history's most underrated diplomats. Cormanther still did not become a multicultural city overnight. Such transformations are not forged by one treaty and a sudden outbreak of principle. They emerge when external pressure and internal imagination finally meet. For Cormanther, that meeting came under Coronal Eltargrim Irithil. He is sometimes remembered as a dreamer. This is accurate but incomplete. Dreamers who alter states are rarely floating free of practical motive. Eltargrim had watched the threats around Cormanthor multiply. Monster incursions, drow pressure, aggressive powers beyond the forest, the broader instability of the inner sea world. All of this made insularity less prudent than it once seemed. He saw, long before many of his fellow nobles could bear to admit it, that Cormanther could not forever defend itself by behaving as though every non-elf were either temporary, useful, or suspect in isolation. Allies would be needed, not mercenaries, not supplicants, allies. This is where the moral beauty of Myth Drannor begins, not in purity of motive, but in the willingness to allow necessity to enlarge ethics instead of merely narrowing them. Many rulers confronted by changing demographics or mounting threats choose retrenchment. They fortify prejudice and call it realism. Eltargrim chose a riskier realism. He argued that the forest should admit selected non-elven wizards, druids, and settlers under protection, and over time he pressed further toward the notion that Cormanthor itself might become a shared city rather than a royal enclosure ornamented by tolerated outsiders. It was, from the point of view of old houses, close to blasphemy. In the year of the Sword and Stars, 220 DR, he allowed non-elven settlers, mages and druids more direct shelter within the greater forest. Do not miss how radical this was in context. It was not simply that strangers might pass through under escort. Unguarded access widened, familiarity increased, practical interdependence deepened. Every such concession strikes an insular elite as catastrophic long before it proves ordinary. Paths once policed become roads, roads become habits, habits become friendships, friendships become claims, claims become politics. Old families understand this process perfectly well, which is why they fight so bitterly at the first stage rather than the last. And into this delicate evolution came Elminster Aumar, because history, like the gods, occasionally possesses a sense of timing at once useful and intolerable. He entered Cormanthor disguised as an elf, was tested by Coronel Eltergrim and the Shrinchi, and was found worthy. I linger on that because it says much about the age. Elminster was not accepted because the city had become indiscriminately trusting. He was accepted because the wisest guardians in it had already begun distinguishing between bloodline and worth with unusual seriousness. That distinction would become foundational. Myth Drannor was never meant to be a city where ancestry ceased to matter. It was meant to be a city where ancestry ceased to be the sole admissible argument. Those are not the same thing. The old forest nobility, and above all the House of Starim, reacted with predictable elegance and appalling restraint, by which I mean they nearly tore the project apart. The Starim were no trivial holdouts muttering behind curtains. They were ancient, proud, politically capable, and deeply offended by the entire direction of Eltargrim's reforms. To their minds, the coronel was not broadening Cormanthor. He was diluting it, exposing it, cheapening the sacrifices of older generations, and inviting into the heartwood those who had neither earned nor inherited such intimacy. One should never underestimate the emotional force of that kind of aristocratic grievance. It can survive evidence for centuries. It can survive its own disapproval. Often it grows sweeter to its holders precisely because reality keeps refusing to affirm it. So the opening drew opposition not merely from caution, but from wounded identity. This matters. If Myth Drannor is remembered only as the triumph of inclusiveness, one misses the scale of its audacity. Eltargrim was not persuading a mildly skeptical assembly to improve trade policy. He was asking an ancient elven power to treat other races as more than adjacent phenomena. He was demanding that status, law, and urban intimacy reflect an altered theory of civilization. Shared defense is one thing, shared streets are another. Shared schools and shared sanctuaries cut deeper still. And then there is the most radical question of all, shared belonging. That is the question at which reform always becomes existential. Can those unlike us belong without first becoming us? Myth Drannor answered yes, not cheaply, not unanimously, but yes. And because great answers require corresponding forms, the city needed a mythal. We should pause long enough to be worthy of that word. A mythal is not a glorified ward, nor merely a civic enchantment with excellent publicity. In elven history, it is an act of high magic, of tremendous scale, shaping not only defense, but possibility. A mythal can protect, constrain, attune, and alter the very texture of life within its bounds. It is, among other things, a moral instrument. What a people choose to build into a mythal tells you what they fear, what they cherish, what they are willing to privilege, and what kind of future they are trying to make physically durable. Eltargrim and his allies understood that if Cormanthor were to become myth Drannor in more than rhetoric, the city needed a magical environment equal to its social ambition. It would have to be safe enough for trust to grow, ordered enough for difference to coexist, and wondrous enough to attract those whose presence would make the experiment real. This was not a simple civic upgrade. It was the attempt to cast an ideal into weather. The decisive year came in 261 DR, resistance sharpened to violence. A Starim-led revolt erupted at court, and dozens of nobles died in the struggle before the coronal, the Srinshi, loyalists and allies such as Elminster broke the rebellion. There is no cleaner proof that myth Drannor was no soft utopia than this. It began under internal bloodshed. The city's future had to be defended against elves before it could be shared with others. History does enjoy its ironies. Then the high magic began. 14 spellcasters stepped forward to raise the mythal. Mithanthor served as primary caster, with Eltargrim, the Srinshi, Arendu Ekorn, and Erinspir Ongluth among the principal secondary workings, while tertiary casters included not only elves, but also figures of mixed or human blood, among them Elminster himself. That detail should be savoured. The city was not merely opened by decree to non-elves after the mythal rose. Non-elven hands and minds were already among the agents by which the city's great magical covenant took shape. Mithanthor paid for that covenant with his life. As the old accounts tell it, he gave a dying charge that the full powers of the mythal not be idly explained, and that only the rudiments be taught to younglings of all races. The warning is revealing. Even at its founding, myth Drannor's greatest minds understood that a city of openness could not survive by making every lever equally casual to every citizen. Shared belonging is not the same as universal operational clearance. The dream had boundaries from its first breath. And then the name changed. Cormanthor became myth Drannor. The renaming matters almost as much as the spell. Names are how cities tell later generations what sort of story they mean to be. The new name honored the memory of Drannor, an older elf remembered for crossing the boundary of his age so completely that he loved and married a dwarf. That is not a decorative flourish. It was a deliberate statement, almost a provocation. Myth Drannor would not define its greatness by purity of lineage or enclosure of tradition, but by the possibility that love, fellowship, and civic purpose could move through lines many elves had treated as permanent. The city was in effect named after the refusal of racial vanity. No wonder some houses hated it. No wonder later ages loved it. The coronal's dream was now no longer merely policy. It had form, name, weather, and ward. The old records speak of the city thereafter as the first truly equal alliance of elf and entelquess. I take the phrase seriously, but not lazily. Equal alliance does not mean all prior asymmetries dissolved like mist. The city remained in an elven realm. Elven institutions still carried disproportionate weight. Elven high magic, not human wizardry or dwarf rune lore, anchored the mythal. Yet what changed was nevertheless immense. Other races were not merely tolerated inside a superior frame. They were invited to help constitute the frame. They were asked to belong within its promise. That is a rare thing in Faerûn, rarer still when it lasts. And last it did. For long enough that memory had time to grow affectionate. For long enough that children were born who assumed mixed streets were normal. For long enough that later cynics, looking backward through ruin, would forget how many centuries it takes to sustain a fraud if fraud is all you think it was. Myth Drannor endured because it was more than pageant. It was institution, labor, and repeated consent. That is what we must walk through now. What did that consent look like when it had settled into ordinary life? This is where lesser tellings often fail Myth Drannor most completely. They treat the city as if it existed only in marble abstraction, all silver bows and impossible towers, until monsters arrived to do useful narrative violence. But a city that survives for centuries does so by being lived in. It must feed people, house them, move them, police them, educate them, tax them, entertain them, annoy them, and convince enough of them, often enough, that remaining is preferable to leaving. Myth Drannor did all of this. At its height, the city and its immediate community held more than 50,000 year-round inhabitants, with elves still the great majority, but humans, dwarves, gnomes, and halflings present in numbers far beyond tokenism. The city's seasonal traffic pushed higher still. That demographic fact matters because it distinguishes Myth Drannor from the polite fiction practiced by many realms, where one may find a cosmopolitan quarter precisely because the larger state has no intention of sharing itself more deeply than that. Myth Drannor was not a single market street where outsiders could rent rooms so long as they remained useful and went home at dusk. It was mixed habitation at civic scale. The physical city reflected that scale of experiment. Buildings of exquisite elven grace stood beside newer constructions raised by humans with their characteristic impatience for waiting 3 generations until the Angles feel properly persuaded. The Eastern Quarter in particular grew with startling speed as non-elven settlement expanded, and conservative eyes noted with poorly disguised horror that human building practices did not always consult the same aesthetic conscience as the Old Forest. One hears in such complaints the usual aristocratic lament, that inclusion is all very well until it changes the look of the street. My sympathy, you will be shocked to learn, is limited. Still, the tension is worth preserving because it shows where ideals become tactile. It is one thing to welcome another people in principle. It is another to discover that they roof differently, carve differently, light differently, purchase differently, and expect the city to accommodate those habits materially rather than applauding from a safe ceremonial distance. Myth Drannor accommodated, not perfectly, but genuinely. A citizen of the city might rise in a home shaded by trees shaped with elven care, or in a newer dwelling built with more mortal haste and thicker straight lines. He might set out along smooth ways where enchantment and planning softened the wear common to other cities. He might pass public arches inscribed for portal use, guards or clerks collecting the small silver toll required of entrance to certain gates. He might move under weather made gentler by the Mythal's broad beneficence, under drift globe lights or subtler magical illumination that helped the city glow rather than glare. He might hear Espruar, common dwarven speech, halfling laughter, and the clipped practical tones of traders all within a single square. A temple bell might answer birdsong. A forge might ring not far from a bardic school. A patrol of armathors could pass an unarmored citizen whose very fashion signaled trust. That fashion deserves its own moment because it reveals more than any manifesto could. The old descriptions tell us that under the peace of myth Drannor, clothing among elves and many humans became strikingly unconcerned with armor or concealment. To go armored in ordinary society, unless one were a guard or an adventurer in obvious transit, could be treated as rude. Garments often left the chest or heart region more exposed, not from frivolity alone, but as a social signal that fear had receded and trust was habitual. There is something astonishing in that. In a world where most settlements teach caution through walls, cloaks, belts, and hands kept near blades, myth Drannor for a time encoded confidence into dress. The body itself became civic rhetoric. Only a very safe city dares that, or a very foolish one. Myth Drannor was safe enough that the practice made sense. That, perhaps, is the truest praise I can offer. And yet safety there was never merely sentimental. It was engineered. The city maintained armathors for urban defense and protection of the coronal, a wider Achvelar for the forest and realm, and the Achfair for magical warcraft. It maintained court mages, honor spell guards, and disciplined patrols. This was not a peace that happened by accident because everyone sang attractively enough. It was peace backed by force, vigilance, training, and deeply layered magical architecture. Here we come to the charter in spirit. If one reads the records not as a collector of dates, but as a student of governing intention, several principles emerge again and again. First, the city sought coexistence not as episodic diplomacy, but as daily structure. Peoples were to live near enough one another that mutual dependence would become normal rather than exceptional. Shared markets, schools, inns, roads, shrines, and guard service matter more to durable peace than declarations written for festivals. Myth Drannor understood this. It invited interweaving rather than supervised adjacency. Second, the city held that craft, learning, and service should circulate across racial lines. Non-elven wizards were not forever kept at the outer gate. Dwarves were not limited to trade days and then escorted politely back to their own jurisdictions. Halflings and gnomes were not ornamental proofs of goodwill. The city's colleges, guilds, patrols, and civic life reflected a sincere belief that talent and loyalty could arise outside elven blood and should be cultivated when found. Third, the city treated beauty as political. I do not mean that in the shallow sense of propaganda alone. Myth Drannor was beautiful because beauty itself was part of the civic argument. To walk through harmonious streets, under moderated weather, past structures shaped by magical care and mutual confidence, was to be instructed emotionally in the possibility of a higher common life. Beauty told residents and guests alike, this peace is not merely the absence of war, it is a richer form of living. Netheril had also been beautiful, yes, but its beauty often served altitude, hierarchy, and exemption. Myth Drannor's beauty was meant to be participatory. The difference matters. Fourth, the city accepted that openness required selective hardness. This is where the charter becomes wonderfully, painfully serious. Myth Drannor opened to all races on equal terms in aspiration, but its mythal and laws never implied moral stupidity. Public gates could be used by allies and traders, but not every creature or race was treated as equally admissible to the experiment. The mythal imposed hard interdicts against specific threats. Chromatic dragons, drow, duergar, illithids, doppelgangers, orcs, ogres, hobgoblins and goblins were not simply welcomed and asked to feel included. The city barred them, redirected them, or denied them entry by magical means. Certain forms of scrying, charm, and magical intrusion were thwarted at the boundary. High magic could move differently within it, but abuse was constrained. This is important enough to say plainly. Myth Drannor was not built on the assumption that every difference is harmless if one is sufficiently virtuous about it. It distinguished between neighbors and predators. That is not hypocrisy. That is civilization. A city that forgets the distinction in order to flatter itself does not remain a city long. Fifth, the city accepted asymmetry without wholly surrendering the ideal. This is the most difficult principle and the one critics find easiest to mishandle. The Mythal's famed overmantle gave remarkable daily protections to elves within its bounds. Resistance to poison, defense against missiles, one negation of hostile spell per day, even the gift of flight at will under certain circumstances. Non-elves, however valued in the city, did not simply inherit the same native bond to the mythal. Elves remained privileged by the deepest magical structure of the realm. Does that invalidate the dream? No, but it complicates it beautifully. Myth Drannor was not a modern fantasy of sameness. It was a serious attempt to build a shared city out of peoples who did not possess identical histories, identical capacities in high magic, identical numbers, or identical authority in the founding order. The city was therefore equal in invitation more than in endowment. Its promise was not that every distinction vanished. Its promise was that distinction need not determine civic worth, legal belonging, or access to dignity. That is harder than sameness, and perhaps nobler. Because sameness is easy to praise when one is imagining it. Coexistence among unlike peoples who remain unlike is the truly difficult art. Myth Drannor practiced it. Consider the coinage. Even money in the city spoke symbolically. Coins bore emblems of the races and clasped hands, binding exchange to fellowship. That is not trivial. States place on their money the things they think ought to outlast the transaction. Some place kings, some place gods. Myth Drannor placed shared recognition. The city wanted even a purchase at market to remind one that value was crossing hands in a polity founded on more than common necessity. And the markets themselves were no mere convenience. They were one of the central theatres in which trust became routine. Dwarven wares, halfling produce, human speed of adaptation, elven refinements of craft, gnomish contrivances, lore from wandering mages, and the regular gossip that does more to stabilize mixed populations than any sermon, all met under the same urban breathing. A child reared in myth Drannor could learn before adolescence that other races were not legends from across a border or rivals glimpsed on negotiation days. They were bakers, teachers, patrol captains, drinking companions, competitors, irritations, spouses, creditors, musicians, and neighbors. Never underestimate the civilizing force of irritation either. Hatred thrives best at distance. Shared routine does not erase prejudice, but it forces prejudice to encounter laundry, debt, talent, kindness, and foolishness in forms too specific for myth to digest cleanly. This is one reason cities of coexistence frighten purists so much. They do not merely preach tolerance, they produce acquaintance, and acquaintance is lethal to grand racial theories. Myth Drannor also made learning dangerously permeable in the best sense. Schools, circles, and magical instruction opened possibilities that many other realms reserved jealously by bloodline, temple, or guild secret. One can draw a straight line from the city's intellectual openness to its later role as mother or inspiration of sister communities across the realms. When students from different peoples learn under the same roofs, they do not remain ideologically local. They carry methods, assumptions, loyalties, and ambitions outward. In time, the city became not merely a place, but a networked dream. That would prove both glory and strain. For now, linger on the glory. Imagine the gate halls, where portals linked myth Drannor to other elven realms and sister cities. Imagine Silver's Gate, a threshold not simply to another district, but to a far-flung allied geography. Imagine Honor's Gate opening toward the Forest of Myr. Imagine the mixture of confidence and administrative burden involved in operating such things. Portals compress distance, and with distance, they compress political patience. A city with roads may delay trouble for weeks. A city with gates invites immediacy. Trade accelerates. Friendship accelerates. Diplomacy accelerates. So do error, panic, espionage, and invasion if one misjudges badly enough. In peacetime, however, what magnificence! To be able to step from the city of song into sister communities elsewhere in Faerûn was to inhabit not just a city, but a civilizational proposition. You belonged, potentially, to a lattice of fellowship rather than a lonely jewel. And this, too, is part of the charter. Myth Drannor was not trying to become the one beautiful exception, while the rest of Toril remained as it had been. It was attempting gradually to seed a broader pattern. The dream was contagious by design. That helps explain why later ages from Silvery Moon to lesser mixed settlements seem to carry an afterimage of myth Drannor, whether they admit it or not. Even where the direct institutional line is faint, the notion of a city that can be more than racially guarded coexistence owes much to Cormantheir's grand experiment. Modern listeners often speak of inclusive realms as though the idea appeared fresh each century like dew. Nonsense. Myth Drannor tested much of that vocabulary in steel, spell, and stone before many later human kingdoms had learned how to spell tolerance without choking on it. But again, it was not naive. This is what I most wish to preserve. There were tolls on public gates. There were guarded and hidden portals. There were military hierarchies. There were court loyalties. There were laws and patrol jurisdictions. There was controlled knowledge around mythal workings. There were peoples excluded because the city deemed them incompatible with its safety. There were elven protections not equally shared. There were certainly unspoken gradients of prestige in daily life, because any mixed city of long standing acquires them whether founders intend it or not. The beauty of myth Drannor was never that it lacked power. It was that power there was asked, more than in most places, to justify itself by what it made possible for others. And it worked. That, too, must be spoken bluntly. It worked for centuries. One does not build a fraud that endures through multiple generations of mixed service, study, trade, marriage, memory, and mutual defense. One builds rather a real thing with contradictions. Perhaps that is why the city continues to hurt. Contradictions can be managed. They need not be fatal, but they do require maintenance. They require people after the founders who understand the founding tension deeply enough to keep reinterpreting it in good faith. No mythal can do that part for you, not even the most splendid. Now let us take the city at its own word and press upon the most dangerous mechanism in it, the gates. Any listener who has ever defended a harbour, a mountain pass, a teleportal, or even a well-run market district will understand the principle immediately. Openness is not a feeling. It is a logistics problem with moral consequences. Myth Drannor's gates were marvels. Public portal arches, carefully marked and governed, allowed movement in and out with a speed no ordinary city could match. Gate halls tied the city to distant elven realms and allied settlements. Lesser hidden or restricted portals formed a subtler circulatory system known fully only to those entrusted with such knowledge. Taken together, these made the city more than a geographic point. They made it a hinge. A hinge is glorious. A hinge is vulnerable. This is the security dilemma at the core of the city's greatness. Every open gate increases prosperity, alliance, traffic, and relevance. It also increases the number of decisions that can kill you. In ordinary urban life, the dilemma can feel abstract. Merchants arrive more quickly. Students and travelers enrich the city. Artisans come in search of patrons. Messengers shorten diplomatic lag. Friends and families remain connected across vast distances. A city of gates can become intellectually and economically brilliant because it sits inside many worlds at once. Myth Drannor did exactly that. Its fame was not confined to the forest because the forest no longer confined it. Its schools, guilds, and shared civic style radiated outward along the very channels that kept the city supplied with novelty. But gates do not transport only goods. They transport assumptions. They transport ambition. They transport every quarrel of every connected place. A gate, therefore, forces a city to decide, repeatedly and at scale, what kind of risk it is willing to normalize for the sake of its ideal. Too much caution, and the city becomes a museum of a principle it no longer practices. Too much trust, and every crisis elsewhere acquires direct access to your throat. Myth Drannor did not evade this problem. It managed it for a long time by layering openness over discrimination. Public gates existed, yes, but with tolls, oversight, and known routes. Hidden gates were closely guarded, some portals connected only to trusted Lotii. Others were effectively strategic assets rather than common conveniences. The city's magical and political administrators understood perfectly well that a gate is not neutral simply because it is beautiful. Nor was the problem only external. An open gate changes the people within the city just as surely as it changes who can reach it. More arrivals mean more housing pressure, more guild competition, more cultural friction, more succession disputes about what the city now is. Success produces scale, and scale is where ideals begin paying interest on their own rhetoric. The records suggest that within less than 2 centuries of the opening, Myth Drannor nearly doubled in size. That is an astonishing transformation for any city, let alone one trying to preserve an aesthetic, magical and political equilibrium among multiple peoples with very different lifespans, reproductive tempos, building habits and expectations of civic advancement. Elves measure time in one way. Humans, inconveniently, continue to measure it in years. A realm that invites both cannot pretend the difference will stay private. And so the first paradox appears. The city's success endangered the conditions of its success. When too many people want to dwell in the symbol must either sprawl, stratify, or restrict. Myth Drannor did all three in sequence and unevenly. It expanded physically, especially where newer, non-elven habitation pressed eastward. It stratified socially because established houses, guilds and schools naturally accrued influence over who could really flourish there. And eventually, it restricted. By the 5th century after the opening, the city had become so desirable and so strained that new permanent residence was no longer simply a matter of deciding to move there. Settlement increasingly depended on inheritance, guild acceptance, or school affiliation. New homes ceased to proliferate freely. One can hear in that policy both prudence and retreat. Prudence, because no city can absorb forever without breaking its own systems. Retreat, because the dream of openness was already having to protect itself by becoming more selective in practice than in legend. This is not a condemnation, it is an adult observation. Anyone who imagines that an open city need only stay open longer and more purely without confronting the material limits of space, defense, supply, and institutional attention is not an idealist. He is an infant with a gate key. The problem of sister cities deepened the matter. Myth Drannor did not merely attract people inward, it inspired and helped generate daughter settlements and allied communities elsewhere. This was in one sense the triumph of the idea. The dream proved exportable. One great city was becoming a pattern rather than an anomaly. But the export of talent is never free. Every wizard teaching abroad, every craftmaster helping found another mixed settlement, every guard captain or civic organizer drawn outward by expansion, is brilliance not standing watch in the mother city. In time, the very success of Myth Drannor's model helped thin the concentration of excellence that had made the original so dazzling and secure. I find this almost unbearably poignant. The city was weakened partly by being imitated. Could any outcome be more suitable to a noble experiment? Even in peacetime, then, openness had cost. Not failure, cost. And there were subtler examples of the gate problem as well, less glorious and more embarrassing. Consider the Guild of Naturalists and their two-way portal into the underhalls beneath Mount Melerbode. Curiosity, scholarship, and the old mixed city habit of exploring outward led to dealings with dangerous depths that should have inspired greater suspicion. Those underways connected eventually to deep-spawn breeding caverns, and the resulting troubles contributed to the long horror later called the Beast Marches. Here, the lesson is excruciatingly clear. A city organized around intelligent exchange can begin to flatter itself that every threshold is merely another opportunity for learning. Often it is. Sometimes it is a monster nursery with paperwork. The distinction is administrative only until it becomes anatomical. This, if you like, is the practical face of open gates as a security dilemma. Not every danger arrives in marching order beneath a black banner. Some arrive as respectable research. Some arrive through the habits of confidence. Some arrive because a society accustomed to benefiting from permeability becomes less emotionally equipped to say, no, that door stays shut. Not because we fear knowledge, but because knowledge is not the only thing a polity needs. You see how close this lies to our Netherese lesson. The contrast between those civilizations is real, yet not absolute. Netheril believed magical scale could answer every problem. Myth Drannor believed shared life under magic could elevate peoples beyond their old suspicions. The first overvalued mastery. The second, perhaps at times, overvalued permeability. Both were magnificent. Both required harder administrators than their admirers prefer to imagine. And yet, Myth Drannor remained the healthier of the two, by an order of moral magnitude. Why? Because when it practiced openness badly, it did so in service of relationship rather than domination. That does not spare it from consequence, but it does tell us what kind of error it was more prone to make. Netheril's danger was the conceit of too much command. Myth Drannor's danger was the burden of too much generosity, pressed through finite structures. One may prefer the latter danger without becoming blind to it. Indeed, one must. The city's defenders and planners seem to have understood this intermittently. Public portal use was governed. Hidden gates were not common property. Military officers thought strategically about which thresholds could be defended and which might need denial in extremis. Yet such prudence must be renewed across generations, and that is where every open commonwealth trembles. The founder knows why the system is balanced so delicately. His grandchildren know mostly that it works. Their grandchildren know that it has always worked, which is a far more dangerous belief. Habits of success generate citizens who mistake maintained equilibrium for nature. So long as Eltargrim lived, Myth Drannor possessed something that cannot be institutionalized cheaply. A founder whose moral authority was bound up with the city's purpose. He did not solve every tension by himself. Only children narrate history that way. But he represented continuity between the ideal and the rulership. He could remind elves why the city had opened, remind non-elves that the invitation was real, restrain houses that mistook old pedigree for veto power, and interpret each new strain through a vision larger than the grievance of the weak. Founders die. Their cities then discover whether the ideal has become constitutional or merely charismatic. This is where the gates become metaphor in their fullest sense. A city may keep the arches standing while closing inward emotionally. It may continue to admit travelers while hardening access to influence. It may preserve the language of openness while allowing status, guild interest, and ancestral anxiety to determine which voices count when danger rises. Myth Drannor, after its long golden strength, would increasingly suffer from just such half-closures. The gates remained. The courage behind them thinned. That is not the same as saying the dream was false. It is saying the dream had become expensive enough that later generations wanted the prestige of it more than the discipline. That too is a common civic illness, and it always invites predators. There is a cruelty peculiar to successful cities. They train their inhabitants to believe that the form of life they have inherited is more natural than it really is. That is no small part of what happened after Myth Drannor reached its long maturity. By 650 DR, the city was still a marvel, and by 661 DR, it stood at the height of its peace and prosperity. To be native to Cormanthea was a mark of prestige far beyond the forest. Mixed villages and affiliated communities had grown elsewhere. The city of Song had become not merely a working experiment, but a civilizational exemplar. If one wished to argue that different peoples could live in durable sophistication without reducing one another to tributaries or carefully segregated clients, one could point to Myth Drannor and smile. The smile would not survive the next decades. Coronel Eltargrim died in 661 DR. Much in history can be overstated. This loss is difficult to overstate. Founding figures often become irritating in legend because later ages credit them with every virtue the institutions around them failed to preserve. I have no wish to canonize Eltargrim into a secular saint with point ears and no administrative imperfections. But the records are plain enough that his death marked a real turning. With him passed not just a ruler, but a living interpreter of the city's founding compact. Myth Drannor had rested on fragile chains, one old observer wrote later. Its rulers, the open exchange of learning and craft, the mutual love and respect among its peoples. That phrase, fragile chains, deserves to be engraved above a great many council chambers. Strong cities are often held together not by invulnerability, but by delicate things repeatedly honored. Eltargrim had honored them. His successor, the Princess Aravai Irithel, was no fool and no mere decorative heir. She had been raised to rule. She understood the realm. She even hoped, by her proposed marriage to Josidia Starim, to heal the long wound between the throne and the Starim line. Mark that carefully. She was trying to do statecraft of the noblest and oldest sort, to turn a blood feud into continuity by binding prestige to reconciliation. Had it worked, later centuries might speak differently of her. It did not. In 664, Dr. Aravai was murdered. The old sources linger on the bafflement of it, a residue of black mud, no magic sufficient to identify the killer, a death not merely tragic but corrosive because it attacked confidence itself. When a realm built on beauty and trust cannot explain the murder of its heir, suspicion ceases to be a vice and becomes social weather. Every mixed city depends on the belief that law can still identify intention. Remove that belief, and every difference begins searching for enemies. Myth Drannor, already aging out of its founder's clarity, now faced grief without clean causation. What followed in 666 DR is one of the great political grotesques of realm's history, the claiming ceremony of the ruler's blade. Tradition demanded that the sword determine worthiness. Candidates stepped forward. Noble houses, especially among the Gold Elves, invested the event with all the vanity, desperation, and self-regard such ceremonies attract whenever a prestigious office becomes vacant under conditions of fear. The Shrinshi's invitation was broad enough in spirit to encompass any worthy claimant, be ye elf, noble, or other, yet in practice the process remained weighted by ancient expectations. And then the blade began destroying claimants, incinerating them, consuming them, turning a constitutional transition into public theological horror. It is difficult to imagine a more efficient method of converting grief into faction. For 6 days, nobles and would-be rulers died attempting the claim. Street assassinations multiplied, house rivalries sharpened. Open warfare simmered among those who still thought their lineages conferred entitlement to the city's future. By the 6th day, half-elves, dwarves, and humans were approaching the tower as well. And why should they not? If the city truly belonged to all who had built and defended it, how long could succession remain a quasi-sacred drama for old elven houses alone? The ceremony exposed, with incandescent cruelty, the constitutional incompleteness of Myth Drannor. The city had welcomed many peoples into belonging, but its deepest symbolic instruments still expected inheritance to look elven, unless catastrophe made room for improvisation. That catastrophe had now arrived. Notice the difficulty. A city can be sincerely open and still retain core rights inherited from an older order. For centuries, such coexistence may work because a founder mediates the contradiction or because prosperity keeps the question from becoming mortal. But once the succession crisis comes, every unresolved symbolic hierarchy becomes live wire. Those outside the old center ask, reasonably, whether the city they have loved will trust them at the highest level. Those inside the old center ask, often less reasonably, whether opening the answer to all claimants means the city has already ceased to be itself. This was not a problem created by malice alone. It was the bill for partial constitutional translation delayed too long. The resolution was the Council of 12, or rather the improvisation that called itself resolution. Deprived of a single guiding ruler and prompted by counsel interpreted from the tree spirits of the elven court, the realm turned to a council with representatives of multiple peoples and interests. In formal appearance, this was admirable. Human incanists, a gnome officer, a dwarf clan chief, a halfling voice, and various elven leaders all had place. One could argue, not without justice, that the Council of 12 represented the logical extension of Myth Drannor's ethic into governance more explicitly than the old monarchical structure had ever dared. And yet representative breadth is not the same as institutional strength. The Council's flaw was not simply that its members were selfish. Most councils in history contain selfish members and still manage to preserve a state for a while. Its deeper flaw was that it inherited a city whose ideal was emotionally grander than its administrative doctrine. Under Eltargrim, the city had been held together partly by his authority to interpret competing goods. Under the council, those goods became factions. Trade could be manipulated to favor particular houses. Colonial efforts and satellite ventures could serve those with private investments. Squabbling multiplied. Public attention drifted away from the common life of the city and toward the bargaining strategies of its powerful subgroups. This is how republics of hope become committees of interest. Not all at once, by accumulation. The signs of thinning solidarity appeared in the texture of everyday life. Guilds calcified. Under the long lives granted by elven custom and the stabilizing comforts of the mythal, positions turned over too slowly. Advancement became more difficult. Ambitious artists and artisans began leaving for other settlements where there was room to matter. This is a devastating problem for any prestige city. When the ideal is oldest, the talented young often find the institution least permeable. Myth Drannor had once lured people by opening possibility. In time, parts of it became so established that possibility migrated elsewhere. The schools export their best. The guilds export their restlessness. The army soon pays the difference. And it did. Fewer than half the normal number of wizard students joined the Armathors or the Akfair after Eltargrim's passing. Arcane brilliance was increasingly taught abroad, celebrated abroad, deployed abroad. Again, this was in one sense the victory of the idea. The city's learning had gone forth to dignify the wider world. In another sense, it was a strategic hemorrhage. The mother city was losing the concentrated reservoir of skill that had once made it almost absurdly resilient. You can hear the future breaking in that statistic. There were other symptoms. Taverns and inns became more sharply associated with guild or faction. Prices began to vary with race, guild affiliation, and social standing. Such details may sound petty beside dragon attack or fiendish invasion, but I assure you they are not petty at all. They are the molecular structure of civic trust. When the same room no longer feels equally yours, the city has already started retreating from its founding courage. When a halfling, human or dwarf must calculate not only cost, but which establishment signals what allegiance, the mixed commonwealth has begun segmenting into overlapping enclaves of convenience. Not war, not yet. Something colder. A city of subtle permissions. There were idealists still, of course. There always are. The Eternal Srinala arose in 685 DR under Shiael Ildaka, a mixed fellowship of more than 100 souls of many races and creeds dedicated to preserving the old dream and pursuing the Srinshi's vision. I do not mock them. On the contrary, I feel a weary tenderness towards such people. Every civilization needs its custodians of purpose. Yet the records suggest the Eternal Srinala often erred on the side of waiting, hoping for the Srinshi's return, longing for moral clarity to descend from some absent greatness rather than forcing the city's institutions to reckon decisively with present decay. That too is a familiar weakness of idealists. They know what ought to be, but not always how to govern when what is has grown mean. By the closing decades before the Weeping War, Myth Drannor was therefore neither a lie nor a stable utopia. It was a genuine mixed civilization entering late strain. Immigration had lessened but not ceased. Elven discomfort with the city's altered character had by no means vanished. Some sought honestly to preserve the ideal. Others increasingly wished, if not to expel non-elves, then to restore unmistakable elven hegemony inside the Commonwealth. Many simply wanted the city to continue feeling as it had in their youth, which is one of the most politically useless desires ever produced by memory. How exactly were things to remain the same when the founder was dead, the heir murdered, the succession right discredited, the council factionalized, the guilds clogged, the schools exporting talent, and the city's very success straining the terms of residence? No answer came equal to that. And into such ambiguity, ancient evils walked gladly. This is another reason I resist any simplistic tale in which the Weeping War proves openness failed. By the time the Army of Darkness came, Myth Drannor was already dealing with succession, social segmentation, institutional fatigue, and unresolved hierarchies. Yet even then, the city remained worth defending to a remarkable number of people across racial lines. That fact alone should shame the cynics. If the place had been mere elven theatre, non-elves would not have died for it as they later did. They would have bartered, fled, or watched from safer hills. Instead, they fought. Why? Because the city, in spite of its late flaws, had become home. Because people do not bleed in that fashion for propaganda. Because the best idea anyone ever had in Faerûn was still recognizably better than the world waiting outside it. That is what the coming war must be measured against. Not perfection, value. The Army of Darkness did not spring full-armed from nowhere merely because tragedy required an antagonist. It emerged, as the worst enemies often do, from neglected, unfinished business. Long before the Weeping War, a Netherese archwizard named Aldlas Sodhese had pursued the Nether Scrolls with the usual mix of brilliance and poor moral refrigeration characteristic of his kind. In the tangle of his ambitions, there became entangled three Yugoloth powers, later remembered as the Trio Nefarious: Almpeiter, Malimshire, and Galguth. They were not simple battlefield fiends, still less decorative demons added to spice a campaign map. They were intelligent, calculating, and capable of building coalition among races and creatures who normally needed little encouragement to murder each other, but rather more to cooperate. Earlier rulers and high mages of Cormantha had imprisoned them high above the city. Here again, Myth Drannor's history reveals its own sharp edge. Great civilizations are often ringed not only by roads and allies, but by old sealed catastrophes managed just well enough to remain out of daily conversation. The people beneath continue buying bread. Children continue playing under towers. Meanwhile, somewhere above the civic heart, there hangs an unresolved disaster awaiting one bad day. In 708 DR, that day came. A benevolent red dragon named Garnet, flying above the city, inadvertently weakened the ancient bindings and freed the Trio Nefarious. One could hardly devise a better emblem for the fragility of complacent greatness. Not an invading tyrant battering the walls, not a cursed traitor in the council chamber. a friend of the city by innocent passage, disturbing the old containment of a horror most citizens scarcely remembered. This is how decaying systems often fail. Not by obvious assault alone, but because yesterday's emergency has been stored overhead without sufficient renewal of attention. Once free, the trio did not rush idiotically at the city. They did something far more dangerous. They organized. Over the course of some 29 months, they gathered followers north of the Dragon Sea. Orcs, ogres, hobgoblins, bugbears, gnolls and flins, trolls, yugoloths, undead allies in places. Olmpiter proved the chief strategist, Malimshare the patient intelligence gatherer, Golguth the field commander of brute force. Within 2 years, they had forged what later generations rightly called the Army of Darkness. Not merely a mass of evil creatures, but one of the first great consolidated, multiracial evil coalitions the realms had seen moving toward a single strategic end. Reflect on the bitter symmetry. Myth Drannor had spent centuries demonstrating that many peoples could be aligned by fellowship. Its destroyers demonstrated that many peoples could also be aligned by appetite, command, and common hatred. The contrast is not flattering to any easy theory of diversity as such. Difference does not ennoble itself automatically. It can be organized toward cruelty every bit as effectively as towards civilization. That is why the moral center matters more than the head count. The first phase of the war revealed just how much the city had forgotten how to believe bad news in time. Late in 711 DR, the northern massacres began. Villages and outposts fell, patrols vanished. Survivors arrived with reports so dire that some in safer circles hesitated to credit them. This, too, is an old failing of successful states. Once one has lived long in managed peace, atrocity sounds melodramatic until it is near enough to smell. The forest had known danger before, yes, but not danger like this. A coordinated enemy able to blend monstrous numbers with fiendish planning, pushing through routes and targets with the patience of a real campaign. By the time disbelief gave way to mobilization, the war had already entered the realm's blood. The conflict the elves called the Weeping War lasted through 711, 712, 713, and into the final collapse of 714. More than 80 battles are discernible across 12 major campaigns. Pause over that number. This was not one siege romantically remembered. It was a years-long stripping away of confidence, manpower, supply, allied settlements, magical stability, and civic hope. To narrate it as a single fall is emotionally understandable and historically inadequate. What did the first year feel like? Like a map learning to scream. Outer communities gone silent, escorts failing to return, rangers discovering signs too numerous to be raiders and too organized to dismiss as chance convergence. Villages burned or slaughtered before warning could travel. Refugees carrying not merely tales of attack, but evidence of planning. Routes cut, small strong points isolated, the edges of the Commonwealth tested to see where response lagged. Myth Drannor responded with courage, and also with the late Empire's usual mixture of improvisation and old assumptions. Dragons such as Garnet and Sylvalatham made fierce strikes that, had they been better coordinated with broader strategy, might have broken key elements of the invading host earlier. Allied forces rallied, patrols thickened, harpers and local champions moved to counter specific threats. Yet the enemy kept coming, and worse, kept learning. By 712 DR, the war had intensified into repeated hard campaigns. The harpers at twilight suffered terrible losses in clashes that became legendary for grief rather than triumph. Lich King Lamas and other malign powers complicated the field further, because once a great city begins to stagger, every old enemy smells opportunity. Myth Drannor was not merely fighting the army of darkness in isolation. It was fighting the way catastrophe attracts freeloaders, opportunists, traitors, and side horrors from across the moral landscape. This is another point future city builders should remember. Your enemies rarely line up neatly by category during a crisis. The gate you opened for commerce yesterday may tomorrow interest fiends, spies, necromancers, and smugglers for wholly different reasons. And yet, in the middle of these years, the city's defenders were extraordinary. Let me say that with the force it deserves. Later elf chauvinists, unwilling to process either the city's mixed greatness or their own failures in preserving it, sometimes blamed the Entelquess for diluting Myth Drannor and hastening its end. This is slander. The war record makes nonsense of it. More than half of the junior officers of the Akvalar at the beginning of the conflict, and even some senior officers, were half-elves, dwarves, and humans. Non-elven soldiers were often assigned the hardest fighting under the worst conditions until wiser command put a stop to such prejudice. Gnomes and halflings proved among the staunchest defenders in certain campaigns. Human dead rose to nearly 3/5 of elven losses, despite humans being far fewer in number. Non-elves fought longer and harder than many later pure-blood nostalgists deserve to admit. You may quote me severely on this, if challenged. Myth Drannor did not perish because the outsiders failed it. If anything, the outsiders often proved truer to the city's idea than many who claimed ancestral ownership of it. There is a particular sadness in that. Cities of principle sometimes survive longest in the loyalty of those who were once guests. The second and third years of the war forced exactly the sort of tests the city's gate system made inescapable. Routes once used for trade and fellowship became corridors of strategic necessity. Which gates could still be held? Which sister city links remained viable? Which portals risked becoming liabilities if the enemy penetrated them or merely forced too much evacuation through them? Every decision compressed military, moral, and symbolic stakes into a few archways and their surrounding streets. This is why I keep returning to gates rather than only battlefields. A city like Myth Drannor is not defended solely at its walls. It is defended at its thresholds of meaning. Take the simple matter of whether to close a portal to an ally. Militarily, closure may be prudent if enemy infiltration, magical corruption, or overextension threatens. Politically, it weakens alliance. Psychologically, it announces that the city no longer trusts the network that made it glorious. And once a gate is sealed, what exactly has been preserved? A population, a remnant, a principle, or only time enough for grief to catch up? The Weeping War forced such questions again and again. In 713 DR, there came intervals of tense respite amid the broader disaster. Many residents emigrated to sister cities, Semberholm, and other safer enclaves. One can criticize them if one wishes. I recommend against easy judgments. Not every citizen is called to die in the same street to prove love of the city. Evacuation is also one of civilization's arts. The tragedy lies rather in how each departure made the city simultaneously easier to supply and harder to remain itself. A multicultural wonder reduced, quarter by quarter, to those still willing or able to stand beneath increasingly uncertain protections. What is that if not the gradual thinning of a dream into a garrison? And still the gates worked. Still people escaped through them. Still reinforcements and hope moved by them. Still risk arrived by them too. The city was living inside its founding design all the way into catastrophe. That is why the war feels so thematically perfect and so emotionally cruel. Myth Drannor did not die by abandoning its nature entirely. It died partly because its nature required open structures more difficult to secure under prolonged coordinated assault than simpler, meaner polities would have possessed. Please hear me carefully there. I am not saying simpler, meaner polities were therefore better. I am saying goodness has architecture, and that architecture can be harder to defend than suspicion. Suspicion builds bluntly. Fellowship builds elegantly. Elegance is easier to wound. Yet when it holds, it gives us something far finer to mourn. By early 714 DR, the campaigns were no longer about restoring the wider peace. They were about survival, evacuation, attrition, and deciding what could still be saved from an idea under demolition. Even as the Elven court was being re-established as the seat of power in Cormanthir, Myth Drannor itself was becoming the sacrificial anvil on which the last defenders would try to buy time for others. That shift alone deserves lament. The city that had once tried to model a future for the realms was now being converted into the site at which a narrower elven polity would survive after it. You can already feel the aftershock in that. The Weeping War is not only the loss of a city, it is the loss of confidence in one version of the future. And because Faerûn is what it is, the future that survives is usually smaller, harsher, and easier to govern. That does not make it wrong, but it does make it sad. Let us walk the later campaigns more closely, because the details matter. When historians compress a long war into a single noun, they rob the dead twice, first of life, then of sequence. Myth Drannor was not extinguished in one theatrical evening. It was unmade by repeated decisions, repeated heroics, repeated losses, and repeated recalculations under stress. One of the most revealing battle clusters concerns Silver's Gate. Silver's Gate was more than a tactical portal. It linked the city to the Silvery Moon Pass and thus to a broader world of friendship, relief, and strategic possibility. In peace, it exemplified what Myth Drannor meant to be. Connected, confident, culturally radiant beyond the forest, willing to make distance negotiable in the service of common good. In war, it became a nerve. To hold it was to keep open the possibility of aid and movement. To lose it, or even to be forced into closing it, was to watch the city's ideals contract into emergency geography. The second siege around Silver's Gate became exactly that kind of turning point. Defenders fought with brilliance and fury. Elminster himself was drawn into the struggle, so too were heroes whose names survive partly because the gate made martyrs efficient. Hundreds of enemies fell. Tactical success could be claimed in local terms. Yet strategically, the engagement proved one of those victories that taste of ash. The pressure around the gate and the realities of defending far-flung links under sustained assault forced Myth Drannor to close many of its portals and sever lines that had once made it mighty. This is why I say gates are promises and problems. The city won the battle. The enemy advanced in meaning. For once, your commonwealth must begin closing the very roots by which it practiced fellowship. Something in the soul of the polity has already moved from confidence to triage. Do not think the defenders were blind to this. They knew. That is what gives the decision its tragic dignity. There are closures one makes because one has grown mean. There are closures one makes because a host of fiends has made generosity tactically suicidal. Wisdom lies in knowing the difference. History lies in admitting that both kinds leave scars. Other campaigns showed the same pattern from another angle. Temples that had once testified to the city's interwoven sanctities became redoubts, then liabilities, then sacrificial structures. During the desperate fighting remembered as Temple Star's fall, shrines of Moradin and Gal Glittergold, precious proofs that dwarves and gnomes were not decorative minorities, but fully housed members of the city's sacred life, were lost in action that bought time and space for withdrawal. Think on that image carefully. A mixed city defending its remnant by letting some of its most eloquent symbols of mixed belonging become rubble. There is theology in that ruin. Faith was not repudiated there, it was offered. Yet the fact remains. The architecture of coexistence became fuel for survival. If you have ever loved a city, you know how unbearable that must have been. Not all losses in war are counted best in bodies. Some are counted in what one chooses to break with one's own hands because the enemy has left no cleaner option. Honor's Gate, later in the disaster, gives us the nobler version of the same pain. There, members of the eternal Srinala, together with halfling archers and human warriors, held the line long enough for many civilians and survivors to flee toward the forest of Mir. They then destroyed the route behind them to prevent the enemy from profiting by the same passage. The image could serve as emblem for the entire fall. Idealists who had spent years trying to preserve the old dream through persuasion now became the grim custodians of its partial evacuation. Halflings, so often patronized by grander chroniclers, proved indispensable in the kind of accurate, stubborn fighting urban retreat demands. Humans stood with them. The gate, once an avenue of friendship, became a one-way mercy, then had to die. There is no lecture more concise than that. A city may be forced to survive by cutting the arteries that made it itself. The warriors at Honor's Gate did not betray Myth Drannor by destroying the passage. They honored it in the only way left, by ensuring the city's people, rather than its infrastructure, remained the thing saved, if saving both was no longer possible. Elsewhere, portals became points of madness, tactical obsession, and last-minute sacrifice. The Warrior's Gate, too, would in time be destroyed in the pressure of final retreat. Every such loss narrowed the strategic horizon and deepened the moral wound. It is one thing to lose a wall tower. One can imagine rebuilding the stones. It is another to lose a gate that represented a relationship. The ruin then says not merely we were breached, but we were severed. You will perhaps accuse me of dwelling too much on symbols. Very well, cities are symbols with tax rolls. To understand why myth Drannor hurts, one must take its symbols as functional truths. The war also revealed again and again the quality of the mixed defense. Halflings excelled as snipers and skirmishers in urban and woodland transitional space. Gnomes, too often omitted by more self-important narrators, proved invaluable in precision, engineering, and tenacity. Dwarves fought with the heavy steadiness all good cities eventually discover they need when elegance alone no longer holds the line. Humans supplied not only numbers, but a species of flexible desperation at which their people have long excelled. Short-lived folk often understand the urgency of a collapsing season better than their immortal neighbors. Half-elves, naturally suited to inhabit the city's mixed ethic, stood in officers' posts and command situations where interpretive loyalty mattered as much as swordcraft. This is no small point. Defending a multicultural city is not simply a matter of staffing battlements with a census. One needs officers capable of understanding the habits, fears, strengths and grievances of multiple constituencies under stress. Myth Drannor had such people. That it still fell is not evidence that mixed command fails. It is evidence that even excellent mixed command may be overwhelmed when political fatigue, external coordination, and ancient fiendish intelligence combine at scale. The defenders also suffered from prejudice within their own house. The records make clear that non-elves were at times pushed into the hardest fighting under the worst conditions until senior leadership intervened. This ugliness must not be hidden merely because the city is otherwise beloved. Ideal societies do not cease producing injustice under pressure. Often the pressure reveals which quiet hierarchies were never fully gone. The nobility of myth Drannor lies not in some false innocence, but in the fact that enough of its leaders and citizens recognize such injustice as betrayal of the city's purpose rather than its natural right. That recognition, too, is part of why the city remains worthy of reverence. Consider the overmantle. Earlier, I noted the mythal's special daily protections for elves. In peacetime, this asymmetry could be managed, even defended, as part of the elven magical substrate underlying the whole Commonwealth. In war, it became more complicated. Advantages matter, of course they do. A city whose core defenders include citizens able to fly at need, shrug off certain poisons, and negate one hostile spell each day is not lightly assailed. But what happens when such a system is corrupted, suppressed, or turned unreliable by fiendish pressure and mythal damage? Then the very distribution of expected safety can become a pattern of concentrated vulnerability. This came to hideous fruition in the battle remembered as Overmantle's Bane. On the 23rd day of Kithorn, 714 DR, the Mythol's Overmantle failed or was corrupted badly enough that elves relying upon its aerial grace and protections suddenly found those assurances gone. Some plummeted from the sky. Pause there. There are defeats, and then there are symbolic defeats so exact that history seems almost malicious in arranging them. A city founded on elven high magic, committed to protecting all but still built around real elven magical privilege, reaches its final siege and one of its signature protections becomes the scene of sudden death. Nothing could have illustrated more brutally that no inherited advantage remains safe once the deeper fabric fails. The city was not punished for protecting elves. It was shown in the worst possible hour that no subgroup can float above the common ruin indefinitely. There is a political lesson there, severe enough for every age. Privilege may strengthen a state under normal conditions. But if the system sustaining that privilege breaks, the fall is shared, and often the descent of the specially protected is among the most shocking precisely because they had forgotten to imagine it. Still, the defense continued. And here I must speak well of Captain Eflar Starbrow Melruth. Not as a cardboard hero. The realms have enough of those in ballad already. But as a man who, in the final stages of the war, carried enough of myth Drannor's martial courage to become representative of the whole doomed resistance. Flar helped hold retreats, preserve fractions of the army under impossible conditions, and stand where the line between organized defense and sacrificial delay had thinned almost to nothing. He was no founder, no philosopher coronal. He was something rarer at the end of states. A competent captain who keeps choosing duty after strategy has become grief management. Such men do not always receive the songs they deserve. The campaigns of the final year became increasingly about preserving avenues for escape, keeping the city's defenders coordinated under collapsing magical conditions, and reducing the Army of Darkness's commanders. The Allied side achieved real successes. Malimshire and Gulguth were eventually eliminated in the broader course of the war, stripping the enemy of two of its three master intelligences. There were periods of strained hope when it seemed possible that decapitation of the hostile command structure might yet save the city, or at least avert total sack. But might yet is one of those historical phrases that usually means the ledger has already turned. Almpeiter remained, and numbers remained, and corruption remained, and every closed gate, dead temple, departed artisan, fallen officer, and exhausted wizard kept exact account. Another misery of long siege is that even victory in one district accelerates depletion in the next. Every master archer lost cannot be in two future battles. Every successful evacuation removes civilians, yes, but also the city life for which the war is nominally being fought. Every portal destroyed denies the enemy one route and the defenders one hope. Every time a hero buys a day, the state becomes more dependent on heroism and less on structure. Myth Drannor, in its late war years, suffered badly from this conversion of polity into legend. Legends inspire. Structures endure. The city increasingly had the first where it had once possessed both. By the time the final siege approached, only some 3,000 defenders remained to guard a place that had once embodied a much larger common life. 3,000. Against what was left of an army still numbering in huge swarms, still able to hurl monstrosity and fiendcraft at chosen points, still encouraged by the knowledge that every additional week of pressure harmed the defenders more than itself. One can hardly ask a mixed city to prove its value under sterner conditions than these. And prove it, in one sense, it did. For it fought on. Not because victory was certain, because abandonment would have been a lie about what the city had been. That is one of the few honorable reasons left to fight a doomed defense. Not to deny doom, to deny falsehood. The last campaigns of 714 DR possess an almost liturgical grimness. Cithorn, Flamerule. Names that ought to smell of warmth and summer instead become, in the records, a calendar of attrition. While the Elven Court was re-established as the seat of Elven power, the city that had most fully embodied Elven openness was left under the siege of shadow, beginning on the 21st of Cithorn. The irony is merciless. Cormanthea survived, but in a narrower form. Myth Drannor held, but now as bastion and sacrifice rather than center. This is often how ideals die in statecraft. Not by proving false, but by becoming too expensive for frightened successors. The Siege of Shadow was not elegant. By then the army of darkness had been mauled, decapitated in part, bloodied in many campaigns. Yet that did not make it less dangerous. If anything, a damaged evil host can become more terrible to face at close quarters, for discipline gives way to appetite, while sheer numbers remain sufficient to drown streets in bodies. Olmpiter, the last of the three great Yugoloth commanders, still drove the war with enough intelligence to focus the chaos. More fiends were summoned, more corruption touched the mythal. What planning remained on the enemy side fused with the kind of ravening opportunism that devastated civilian space and exhausted defenders. Here, the old military distinction between battle and sack begins to blur. The city had to be held district by district, portal by portal, evacuation route by evacuation route. Defenders no longer asked only, "Can this position be kept?" They asked, "How long must it be kept for those behind us to get clear?" Such fighting changes the soul of an army. It is no longer an instrument of policy, it becomes an instrument of witness. We were here. We did not abandon you first. Remember that. I suspect many of the defenders, especially the non-elven ones, were fighting by that stage as much for memory as for survival. They knew how later stories might simplify matters. They knew how old prejudices return at the edge of ruin. To stand and die for Myth Drannor, if it came to that, was not only to save others, it was to inscribe a rebuttal against every future lie that would call them incidental to the city or blame them for its weakening. And because history is often indecent, such rebuttals must be written in blood before anyone takes them seriously. The fighting leading into the end saw surviving populations streamed out where possible. The city's gates, once vectors of exchange, now became instruments of triage. Every family that crossed a functioning threshold did so under the protection of those who knew the threshold might not exist by sunset. Every wagon, every wounded soldier, every elder, every child, every archive chest chosen for transport rather than abandonment. Each such movement required a revaluation of what the city now meant. Was Myth Drannor, its buildings, its mythal, its songs, its people, its legal ideals, its surviving lineages, its archives? Under siege, one discovers very quickly which answer one is actually willing to fund with lives. The answer in the end was people first, memory next, stone last. That is as it should be. Yet it leaves the lover of cities in mourning for architecture nonetheless. The Bane's duel, in the final phase, has rightly entered legend. For 2 days, Captain Flower and Almpiter's opposed remnants clashed in the sort of concentrated brutality that only late war produces, too exhausted for grandeur, too committed to yield. Then commander met commander. Flower, Starbrow, Melruth, and Almpiter engaged in mortal combat on the 15th of Flame Rule. The magical blast that ended them robbed both sides of leadership in a single shattering moment. Whether one prefers to imagine Flower victorious in death or merely equal in ruin matters less than the structural truth. The defenders lost the man who had become their focal courage at the precise hour when courage still needed a shape. After that, the final descent became almost inevitable. Not because the defenders ceased to be brave. Bravery remained in obscene supply. But because bravery without enough bodies, enough spell support, enough intact gates, enough mythal coherence, enough rested officers, enough functioning districts, and enough hope becomes arithmetic. Directionless hordes surged by weight of numbers and savage momentum. The city's last defenders were overrun not by superior principle, but by accumulation. Savagery has always relied heavily on accumulation. Out of roughly 3,000 remaining defenders, only some 200 escaped. Let that ratio sit unsheltered for a moment. Not all doom is dignified. Much of it is counting. The city fell, and here we must be careful with our grief. Because fell can mean several different things. Myth Drannor fell militarily when its defenders could no longer hold the streets, gates, and sacred places against the army of darkness. It fell politically when the open Commonwealth ceased to be the governing centre of Cormanther, and power settled back into the more restricted frame of the Elven court. It fell symbolically when the city that had tried to be the future became, in the minds of many survivors, the reason not to try that future again so boldly. But did it fail? Ah, there is the wound. If by failure we mean it did not endure forever, then of course it failed, as every city eventually fails, except in the dishonest sense in which ruins are mistaken for continuity. If by failure we mean its principles were shown false, then I refuse the charge. A society that lasts centuries, binds many peoples into one civic life, inspires daughter settlements, produces mixed armies and mixed loyalties, and is mourned by those who were once supposed to be peripheral, has not disproved itself merely because it is later overwhelmed by fiends, factional exhaustion, and the ordinary mortality of institutions. No. The proper verdict is harder. Myth Drannor proved its idea workable. It also proved the maintenance cost of that idea to be immense. That is different from failure. Very different. One can make the criticism sharper still. The city's greatest weakness was not openness itself, but insufficiently renewed governance of openness after the founder's age passed. The experiment lasted long enough to rely on custom, prestige, and memory. Then those supports thinned. Succession became unstable. Symbolic inclusion outpaced constitutional translation. Guilds and councils hardened around interest. The gate network and exported brilliance that had made the city dazzling also made it strategically demanding to defend. When the great external war came, it struck a polity whose ideals were still beloved, but whose institutions had grown tired. This is not an indictment of coexistence. It is an indictment of assuming coexistence can run on inherited charm. It cannot. No city, however beautiful, can live forever on the moral capital of its founders. That is perhaps the sternest lesson myth Drannor leaves to later ages. Open cities require more maintenance, not less, than exclusionary ones. They require constant interpretation of fairness, security, housing, succession, military service, educational access, symbolic legitimacy, and emergency powers. They require leaders capable of saying both, yes, more people may belong, and no, this threat does not pass. They require institutions that can survive the death of the charismatic visionary without immediately reverting to lineage panic or factional management. They require citizens who understand that peace is not merely atmosphere, but work. Myth Drannor had such citizens for a very long time. Then it had fewer. And the enemy noticed. After the fall, Cormanther withdrew. The elven court barred non-elves. This is both comprehensible and devastating. Comprehensible because a people that has watched its greatest open city die may very naturally decide the world has forfeited its invitation. Devastating because the closure itself announces that the war's deepest political victory belonged not merely to the fiends, but to fear. The old, narrower pattern returned. Safer, perhaps, easier to administer, perhaps, but poorer in moral horizon. Yet, even here, the story does not quite submit to despair. In 720 DR, Elventree was established so that Cormanther might continue commerce and contact with allied non-elves while keeping the elven court itself closed. That is a compromised gesture, yes. It is also evidence that the dream could not be wholly extinguished. The forest realm retreated, but it could not entirely deny that too much had been shared, learned, loved and fought for, to revert simply to ancestral purity. Elventree stands, in that sense, as a small, painful afterimage of myth Drannor, the admission that one still needs relationship, even after fear has won the argument inside the capital. More importantly, for the larger history of Faerûn, the Harpers were refounded at the dancing place in that same year, at the urging of elves who understood that if the city could no longer house the ideal, an organization might. There is profound wisdom in that move. When states fail to carry their highest principles forward, those principles often seek lighter, more mobile vessels. Networks, fellowships, secretive alliances, wandering orders. These become the heirs of what kingdoms could not keep whole. Myth Drannor therefore survives not only in memory and ruins, but in institutional descendants that tried to carry its ethic without demanding a single city bear all the weight at once. We shall come to those borderless custodians soon enough. For tonight, let us remain among the stones, because the ruins matter too. After the fall, the city did not become instantly empty or harmless. Like Nethery's remains, myth Drannor acquired a second life as magnet and warning. Its portals, vaults, half-shattered mythal workings, surviving monsters, undead demons, Yugoloths, old wards, and abandoned treasures made it one of the great adventure-haunted spaces in all the realms. This is fitting, and also almost unbearably sad. A city once celebrated for enabling common life becomes famous in later centuries as the sort of place bold bands enter for peril and plunder. I do not condemn the adventurers entirely. Ruins do need readers, but it is worth remembering what sort of place the ruin once was. When you hear myth Drannor used merely to mean treasure, danger, lost magic, or glorious dungeon, insist gently on the larger truth. It was first a city of neighbors. The monsters came later. That distinction is a moral one, because if we remember the city only as ruin, then its fall becomes all there ever was, and the cynics win twice. Better to remember both, the vibrant commonwealth and the haunted aftermath, the opened gate and the shattered arch, the market and the battlefield, the council chamber and the evacuation route, the clasped hands on the coin and the blood on the paving, the overmantle's grace and its corruption, the founder's dream and the captain's last stand. Only then does grief become honest enough to teach. And what does it teach? That the best idea anyone ever had in Faerûn was not made false by paying a price. It was made precious by showing how high the price can be. There is one more misunderstanding I would like to strangle gently before we close the cabinet tonight. People often speak as though there are only two possible lessons to draw from myth Drannor. The first is sentimental, that if peoples love one another enough, all structural difficulties will eventually yield to beauty, goodwill, and the occasional properly placed mythal. The second is cynical, that mixed high ideals are lovely songs for peacetime, but when real danger comes, blood, walls, and narrower loyalties prove the only serious basis for survival. Both lessons are lazy. The first insults politics. The second insults history. Myth Drannor's actual lesson is more demanding. It says that coexistence can work magnificently, transform daily life, produce loyalty across race and creed, and endure far longer than its critics predict. It also says that such coexistence requires institutions at least as intricate as the ideal itself. When those institutions weaken, beauty does not save them. Neither does nostalgia. One cannot sing a succession crisis shut. One cannot out-aestheticize housing pressure, guild stagnation, strategic overextension, or the administrative burden of portals. Nor, on the other hand, does the later fall prove the mixed city was always delusion. A bridge that stands for 4 centuries before collapsing under sabotage, neglect, and war was still a bridge. It still carried people. It still changed where they could go. The collapse indicts maintenance and circumstance as much as design. This is why myth Drannor remains so relevant to every later age. Take Waterdeep above us, for example, if you like, or Silvery Moon, or any settlement in which many peoples live under one roof of law while trade, roads, portals, and outside powers press upon them. The question is never simply whether such a city should be open. It is how openness is to be governed without rotting into either hypocrisy or panic. Who bears more risk when danger comes? Who decides when a gate closes? Which protections are shared, and which remain unequal inheritances from an older order? How much housing strain can idealism absorb before policy hardens? How are mixed armies promoted, trusted, and remembered? What happens when founders die and the second or third generation inherits the rhetoric but not the inward discipline that made it viable? Those are myth Drannor's questions. They are not antiquarian, they are perennial. One could even say the city's tragedy lies partly in how modern it was before later ages deserved it. Its rulers and defenders grappled with border permeability, demographic transformation, constitutional symbolism, multiracial command, public trust in institutions, networked prosperity, and security asymmetry under magical globalization, if you will forgive the inelegant but accurate phrase. A realm with portals linking sister cities across Faerûn is already living in a world where distance has ceased to protect political innocence. Myth Drannor confronted that condition with more beauty and more courage than many later powers manage, even with the advantage of its example before them. That, perhaps, is why I am reluctant to let cynics sneer at it. They often talk as though the city was silly because it was generous. In truth, it was brave because it was generous. Fear-based polities are common. Any frightened tribe can build a narrower law and tell itself the result is maturity. It takes a rarer kind of confidence to say, we shall build a city in which many peoples may actually belong, and then pay the administrative, military, and emotional cost required to keep that statement from becoming decorative. Myth Drannor paid that cost for a very long time. The bill eventually exceeded the reserves. That does not make the earlier payments counterfeit. It makes them admirable. I would go further. The city may have improved the realms even in falling. Not because collapse is inherently ennobling, what a nauseating idea, but because the memory of the city persisted as standard, rebuke, and inspiration. Later settlements that aspired to broad cooperation did so under the shadow of Myth Drannor. Later organizations that chose to work across race and realm did so in part because they had seen what a shared civic ideal could look like before it was broken. Later adventurers, peering into its haunted courts and overgrown halls, could not help sensing that they were treading not just on old magic, but on interrupted possibility. That interrupted possibility is one of the great emotional engines of the realms. Faerûn is full of places ruined by greed, hubris, invasion, demonology, divine feuds, dragonfire, magical weather, bad succession, or common appetite. But only a few ruins carry the sting of a future that might genuinely have been better than the world that followed. Myth Drannor is one of those. Netheril expanded magical capability. Myth Drannor expanded civic imagination. The one tells later ages what power can do. The other tells them what society can try. If forced to choose which loss was morally worse, I know my answer without hesitation. A floating city is splendid. A shared city is harder, and therefore, when lost, rarer. This is why the city's price still echoes. The price was not only elf dead, human dead, dwarf dead, halfling dead, gnome dead, and all the innumerable griefs implied by those categories. It was also a contraction of political courage. After the fall, it became easier for later powers to say, you see, open commonwealths are luxuries, nice until the monsters arrive. Such conclusions always attract the timid and the self-justifying. They are comforting precisely because they spare one the burden of trying again. Yet, Myth Drannor's centuries of success remain there to trouble that comfort. One may reasonably decide not to repeat its exact model. One may point to its constitutional incompleteness, its founder dependence, its asymmetries, its strain under scale, its portal vulnerabilities, or the danger of exporting too much talent abroad while assuming the center remains eternally self-sustaining. All of that is fair. What is not fair is pretending the city proved fellowship impossible. It proved something narrower and more difficult, that fellowship at scale must be renewed or it decays. There is a difference between an impossible ideal and an unmaintained one. Later ages prefer to confuse them because it justifies laziness. And then there is the matter of ruins as temptation. You knew I would return to that. Netherese ruins tempt the ambitious because they promise stolen scale. Myth Drannor's ruins tempt a somewhat different appetite. Yes, there is treasure, mythal-frayed magic, old blades, hidden libraries, portals, and all the delicious hazards from which adventuring careers are stitched. But there is also the subtler temptation to romanticize the city without understanding the labor it once required. Many later souls want Myth Drannor as symbol, relic, or quest site. Far fewer want the actual political work of living in a place where one's own people do not automatically receive every first claim, where shared law constrains ancestral vanity, where openness needs daily administration, and where security cannot be purchased simply by making everyone unlike you disappear. It is possible, my apprentice, to love Myth Drannor wrongly. One can love its elegance and hate its demands. One can love its songs and dislike its neighbors. One can loot its ruins while inwardly agreeing with the people who thought the opening madness. That too is part of the city's afterlife. So if ever you find yourself among later admirers of Myth Drannor, listen carefully to what exactly they admire. Do they praise the mixed schools, the shared patrols, the beauty of clasped hands upon coin, the willingness to let worth outrank blood, the courage of non-elven defenders who died for a city not all later histories bothered to thank them for? Good. Such admirers are at least hearing the deeper music. But if they praise only the magical splendor, the heroic duels, the famous ruins, the prestige of the name, or the easy melancholy of what a tragedy, without any appetite for the institutional discipline that made the city possible, then they are tourists in grief. Treat them kindly if you must, but do not let them instruct you. Myth Drannor deserves more serious mourners, and perhaps more serious heirs. Now, before the candles stoop too low, let me gather the whole matter as tightly as I can. Eltargrim's greatness lay not in inventing tolerance from nowhere, but in recognizing that changing realities could be answered by larger fellowship rather than harder exclusion. The Mythal of 261 DR did not merely protect a city. It gave magical body to a civic wager that unlike peoples might dwell together under shared beauty, shared law, and shared purpose. Daily life in Myth Drannor mattered as much as its legends. The city worked because coexistence was made ordinary through markets, schools, patrols, shrines, coinage, roads, gates, and the subtle habits by which strangers become neighbors. Its openness was never simple. The city levied tolls, kept armies, enforced exclusions, privileged elves in certain protections, guarded its portals, and negotiated constantly between invitation and defense. Its later weakness came not from the falsity of its ideals, but from the thinning of the institutions required to renew them. succession failure, factional council rule, guild stagnation, exported talent, strained housing, and old anxieties returning through unsealed cracks. The Weeping War did not expose coexistence as childish. It exposed how expensive coexistence becomes when a tired but still noble city faces organized evil at scale. And the fall itself, terrible though it was, did not erase the city's truth. It transferred that truth into memory, into organizations, into later city dreams, into ruins that still ask intruders whether they seek only power or also understanding. That is Myth Drannor's gift and burden. It lets no one remain simple. So let us end, as is proper, not with certainty, but with questions. When you picture Myth Drannor at its height, what do you think actually held it together most securely? The mythal, the coronal, the laws, the beauty of the place, the daily interdependence of its peoples. If one of those fails first, which of the others must compensate, or the whole city begins to thin? Do you judge the city's asymmetries, its elven overmantle, its selective interdicts, its inherited symbolic hierarchies, as prudent scaffolding without which the experiment could never have stood at all? Or do you think those same asymmetries quietly limited how fully the city could translate its own ideals into lasting political form? At what point does necessary structure become the seed of later fracture? And what of the gates? This may be the hardest question of all. If you were charged with preserving such a city, how open would you leave it after the first whispers of coordinated invasion? How late would you keep portals active for trade, evacuation, and allied aid? How early would you begin sealing them to reduce risk? Would you rather betray the city's spirit slowly in the name of survival, or keep faith with the spirit until survival itself becomes doubtful? Which is truer loyalty? Preserving the form, or preserving the people who gave the form its meaning? Consider as well the later retreat into the Elven Court. Was that prudence after unimaginable loss? Almost certainly. Was it also a victory for fear? I think so. Can both be true at once? History, as you may have noticed, specializes in that answer. And perhaps the cruelest question, if you had lived in Myth Drannor during its last decades, after Eltargrim's death, after Aravai's murder, after the council began fraying, when guilds had grown sharp-edged and old confidence no longer came naturally, would you have recognized that the city needed not merely defenders, but renovators? Or would you, like so many in all ages, have loved the memory of what the city had been more than the hard, unrewarding work required to keep it alive in altered conditions? Sit with that one a while. Most civilizations are not lost because no one admired them. They are lost because admiration was mistaken for maintenance. Next time, we follow what survives when a city can no longer carry its own highest idea. We turn from the fall of a place to the persistence of purpose in lighter, stranger vessels, fellowships, hidden hands, borderless loyalties, and the powers that move between realms rather than ruling one throne directly. When kingdoms tire, factions inherit. Sometimes they inherit what was best in the dead city, sometimes what was worst, usually both. That, I think, will take us into a new kind of map. Until then, taleofthelich.com is live. The timelines are there, the connective tissue is there, and the larger argument of this series is gathering there in one place. If tonight's walk through Myth Drannor has reminded you how often the realm's greatest ruins were once solutions before they became warnings, you will find the wider pattern at taleofthelich.com. Merch is coming soon as well. I confess there is something wonderfully improper about turning meditations on civic fragility, portal security, and interracial statecraft into objects for one's wardrobe. But then history has always survived partly by being worn in unexpected ways. If some future shirt or mug prompts a conversation about why Myth Drannor still matters, I shall count that as a respectable service to memory. This episode was brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. If you need a site built with foresight, maintained with care, and structured by people who understand that the generosity of a system must be supported by clear architecture, or it will become a liability, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. And if this tale served you, leave a rating or review. Archives do not preserve themselves, not in hidden stacks, not in cities, not in the minds of later ages, too busy to remember carefully unless someone insists. Until next time, my apprentice, mind the threshold. Honor the gatekeeper who understands why a door exists. Distrust every statesman who praises openness only when others will bear the danger. And if ever you walk beneath broken boughs in the ruins of Myth Drannor, where old light still clings to stone and every archway seems to promise either wonder or ambush, do not ask only what treasure was lost there. Ask what discipline once made such beauty ordinary. For cities are not destroyed only by malice. They are destroyed when enough people begin assuming that the trust, labor, and courage holding them together will continue of their own accord. Good night. May your learning remain exact, your sympathies remain large without becoming stupid, your gates open for the worthy and closed against the ravenous, and your memory proves strong enough to love a great idea without lying about what it cost.